speak. So I'm going to share my screen just in a second with my presentation, and then as mentioned, if you've got any questions or discussions afterwards, I'll quite happily take those. So hopefully everyone can see that on the screen now. And
Yes.
just to introduce what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll be discussing how National Flood Forum and also maybe yourselves at Parish Councils support communities at flood risk. Understandably, I know that this conference is regarding climate change, but one of the biggest factors in our changing climate in the UK is the flood risk. As you've probably all seen over the last few years, the incidences are rising. We are having more and more events, and this can be linked to the ever-changing climate and the increased risk regarding that change. So we'll just talk about how communities are looking to work together and help themselves, and also work in partnership with organisations such as parish councils. So just a little bit of facts about flooding. 1 in 6 homes currently in the UK are at serious risk of flooding, with this increase in more heavy rainfall events that could increase as well. That approximately relates to around 5.2 million households at serious risk of flooding. We haven't then taken into account those properties that are also at risk of flooding, but not in the serious category. So you are looking at very, very large numbers here. More than 2.4 million properties are at risk of flooding from the rivers or the sea, and 55% of those living in flood risk areas know that they are at risk. So that last fact there is quite interesting, is that just over half the people who are in a flood risk area know they're at flood risk, and that we think will increase as more and more rainfall events happen. So this is really important, I think, to set the context here, is that discussions around climate change, I think especially in the UK, are heavily centred around flooding and the flood risk that comes from that. We know that these events are going to increase. They already are, and I think it's very important that we start to future plan and look at this now as a whole, as flooding will be one of the kind of indicators of how our climate is changing. So what does that mean in terms of the challenge? Well, increased flood risk, more events of flooding means that there's a lot of instances of damage, repairing roads, walls and bridges, maintaining continuity of services that are affected by these events. Again, providing short-term, long-term or permanent rehousing for displaced residents. That third one always shocks me, is the fact that we live in the UK and we are now having to think about discussing rehousing or rehousing displaced residents from current flood risk, but also future flood risk. Also looking at how we communicate progress with tackling flood risk and introducing different factors into newer developments within communities. That's the real challenge that's needed at the moment in relation to the flood risk. Obviously, one of the other key factors that I'll touch upon is the impact that this has on people. The framework of when we discuss things such as climate change and climate change adaptation and the risk of flooding really needs to bear into context, well, who is it affecting? It's affecting us, it's affecting people on the ground. And it's really important to remember that flooding is not something that just passes people by. It affects people long term, it affects their mental health, it affects their well-being. And that challenge is probably the biggest one. But obviously it's all linked into these other challenges. So who are the National Flood Forum? We are an independent charity that support and help people across England and Wales. Scotland also has a flood forum called the Scottish Flood Forum. They're a similar charity to ourselves. We help people prepare for flooding. We give advice on what to do before, during and after a flood. We have some information through various social media streams, through our website, also through leaflets and booklets that we produce. We also help people once the flood waters have receded. So once the blue lights have finished within an area that's been flooded, we go in and try and help people recover their lives when they've been flooded. We offer ongoing support. We help them through any trauma. We help them through any support and advice they need in relation to their reinstatement and insurance issues. We work to ensure that flood risk communities are at the centre of policy making and operational delivery. We fight very hard at a political level to ensure that communities' voices are not lost within the kind of toing and froing of what to do with flood risk and how it's worked into climate change adaptation. We are a small charity. We have no core funding. We rely on work such as what we do through projects and also through donations. We also have something called the Blue Pages, which is an independent directory of flood property protection products. We don't endorse or recommend any, but what we do is give people the chance to come on, find a bit of information about what each product does, what information they might need, and also get contacts and links to people who provide independent surveying. So in a nutshell, we've been going since 2001. We started off essentially as a small group of community-minded members who had been flooded in Bewdley after the very bad floods of 2001. And what they realised is that actually there's very little communication and information coming to them in relation to what the future plans were for tackling their flood risk. So they realised they're actually representing their community, having a voice, expanding that voice and being on the ground level really helped them push things forward. Just getting a little bit about what we do. We help with the recovery, as I mentioned. We work for change. We sit on parliamentary committees. We try to make sure and ensure that grassroots are the voice from communities is pushed up to those levels. We also do training in relation to how to install property flood resilience. We give advice on insurance. We have a website which gives you some comprehensive information on that. But really the key things that the National Flood Fund, what we do there is we have grassroots support and engagement, and we facilitate and support flood action groups. That's our bread and butter, essentially. And a real key to that work that we do is empowerment. Our goal at the National Flood Forum is to work with communities who've been affected by flooding, help them just create sustainable flood action groups, build those strong foundations, ensure that it's the community who've been flooded, their agenda, their vision, their leadership that is at the forefront of what they would like to say. We also make sure that we're giving a voice to those flooded people, that they're supported, they're represented, that they're able to push forward what they think needs to happen to help support, to help identify what they need to do and what needs to be done to help them with their flood risk. Flood action groups are autonomous groups of community members that have had flood water enter their homes or businesses. They've gone through the long haul of reinstatement and have united to address the issues that they face. And they go on to reduce their flood risk in the long term. Flood action groups are non-partisan and work in parallel with elected members and MPs. And they also form partnerships with the flood risk management teams to work together. And it's that empowerment, it's that chance to work towards something that is really important for us at the National Flood Forum. And that's a real key motto for us, is that people matter. This is not something that is done as an exercise, as a tabletop exercise, as something done between people who haven't flooded. It's for the people who have been flooded and a chance for them to make a real difference within their communities and address the flood risk that they have experienced and that they are going to experience as well. And it's really key. I think one of the things that local flood action groups do is they sit at the centre and the heart of their community. And I think in today's times, that is really important, with the emphasis on working through community-led action. So again, why am I talking about a flood action group? Why do I think it's important? Again, as flooded people, flood action groups will always have that interest. They will always have the drive, the passion, the commitment to really push forward what they feel needs to be done. They bring the community together in relation to other flooded people as well. This enables them to work in a collective partnership with those that manage their flood risk. It helps them to regularly update and understand what is happening. It can be frustrating. As we know, things take a long time at the moment. Things can be going through the wheel of funding cycles. But what happens is that this support allows them to prepare, reduce the impact on their home and community, understand what they can do, and understand what needs to be done by the flood risk management authorities. Again, they work with other local voluntary groups, instigate and help support community emergency flood plans. So they take the work off other bodies who may be strained, and they are working towards something that they know will help them in the future as well. So what do they do? So as I mentioned, flood action groups get involved in a whole host of things that help them in relation to their flood risk. But a lot of times those initiatives are tied up with climate change initiatives to reduce impacts of that climate change. Initiatives such as slowing the flow in areas, reducing the impact of flooding, schemes such as planting more trees to intake more carbon, but on the offset of that also allow more infiltration into the soil and holding that water back. Those communities work directly with those projects and partners. They work together. They make sure that the collaboration is done from a community level and from grassroots. It's nothing more frustrating to a flooded community than to have somebody coming who doesn't know the area, doesn't know the history, and then implement something onto them that they know will not work or will fail. That local knowledge, that community knowledge is very key, and flood action groups do that on a regular and daily basis. And I think that collaboration is at the heart of this. That community is at the heart of collaborating, empowering people, pooling those resources and that expertise, providing that collective voice, understanding what people can do together. We know that through information and working with flood action groups, collaboration can yield more holistic solutions, draw upon greater diversity of stakeholders, and also bring in different amounts of funding. There's a big drive at the moment. You may have seen, obviously, with COP26 going on as well. There is a big drive to ensure that we have things such as green funding, understanding how we can get more different varied sources of funding currently with the restrictions we have into working on climate change solutions. Flood action groups feel strongly that they should be involved in anything related to flood risk. These are people made up of flooded people who have been affected. These water has got into their houses, it has affected them. On average, it takes up to 6 to 18 months for somebody who's been flooded to get their lives back to normal. And that is something that is very, very hard to push to people, is that it's not something that just once the floodwaters have receded and your insurance process has kicked in, is that it's easy to go back in. So that collaboration is real key, that bringing the community together, working together, helping each other, so they feel like they have somebody there. Also, it's not about information exchange. Flood action groups don't just want to be informed of the next steps. They want to be included in the shaping and the direction and current and future flood risk projects. Making sure that those projects have the right knowledge. There's nothing more frustrating when something is happening in relation to flood risk within your area or climate change adaptation, and people don't understand the local knowledge when they're drawing upon these projects and information. And I think that's really key, is again, it's really important that the community have invested within whatever is happening within their area, whether it be something such as slow the flow, whether it be something such as, you were mentioning it in your earlier chats before I talked about things such as cleaning up litter and debris. Communities are at the forefront of that, and flood action groups have that drive and that passion, especially when it's related to flood risk and climate change, because they do not want to go through those issues again. And this is just an example of community collaboration is different in every way. And I think the left-hand side of those pictures is really important. It's about the community doing something. It's not always just about the nice photo opportunity with a member of parliament. It's about what happens after they've gone, what happens in the long term, what happens working together. And that is really important. That collaboration with your community is very key. I think as an example of working together, so you don't feel that it's just me saying it, we have a good example of something called Shropshire Slow the Flow. And this was something that was funded by the Regional Flood and Coast Committee, English 7 and Y. And what this was is that the Shropshire Council and Shropshire Wildlife Trust identified pilot areas for NFM, natural flood management. Natural flood management is a way which is now seen to benefit nature-based solutions to ensure that we're using nature to combat the risks and increasing incidences of flood risk increasing due to climate change. And that natural flood management is something that is implemented on areas where there are flooded people, where there are landowners, where there are people who need help. And actually what this project did was that it got 5 flood action groups together. Each community came together to form their flood action group. And then those flood action groups got involved in this Slow the Flow initiative and worked alongside those operational leads. So they identified areas, they discussed with local landowners who might have not been willing to work on the project or not having found out about it. And what they then did is that they came together, form a catchment group that included different various stakeholders, which were local farmers, the county council, the environment agency, the farmers union, Severn Trent Water, Wildlife Trust, the RFCC, Natural England and other governmental organisations. And all this came from the grassroots up. It is very important that for these communities, they had that direct input and they were driving how those interventions, how that Slow the Flow project was going to go. Nothing works unless it's from the bottom up, we say. Top-down approach does not work. It is always bound to fail at some point because you are then essentially cherry-picking people who you think may be able to work on it. Whereas actually if you flip that around and work from the grassroots up and involve the community at the inception, what you then get is a more collaborative, more long-standing, long-term solution to some of these problems. And that currently at the moment, that project is continuing. There is regular monitoring of those interventions, and this group meets regularly to understand anything they need to do or any information that they need to exchange and pass on. And it was a great success. In other terms, with flood action groups that we work with, or flood action groups that have done really good things, as mentioned before, when looking at flood risk, when identifying areas that of interest to flood risk management authorities, flood action groups have key walkovers and they identify the issues that need rectifying. Just because of the nature of, I think, the way it works at the moment currently in essentially climate change adaptation and flood risk management, is that there's a lot of the time you're having to do modelling, you're having to do predictions, you're having to do a lot of computer-based desk study. And those people need as much information and input as they can to make sure that those models run effectively. And actually, there's nothing better than having a local community to help you identify what needs to go into those models. Input output is very important in that. If the model is wrong, then the project or the implementation that you're doing will not be right either. On the community side, flood action groups also conduct events. They have cleanup days on their watercourse and surrounding areas. They make sure that if there's certain things that they can bring the wider community into who haven't flooded. So for example, in these pictures, this flood action group decided that one of the biggest problems they had was as their village was in the morning during rush hour times was a rat run, that they had a lot of rubbish being thrown into their watercourse. So they organised a cleanup day. Now, what they did was, as mentioned before, of that collaborative approach, this wasn't just a cleanup day organised by themselves. They worked alongside the parish council there, and they were brilliant in working with the district council to ensure that they got all the equipment needed to help with their tidy up. And actually, that flood action group got involved in what was called Tidy Up Britain initiative. And because of that, they did regular cleanup days on that, and they used this to bring in more of the community who may not have understood that that was having an impact on their flood risk, but that they understood the need to make sure that their area was well kept, cleaned. That was driven completely by the community, and I think that was the real key success of that, is that community drove their wider community. That flood action group drove their community to come and to work together. Also, as mentioned before, flood action groups liaise with flood risk management authorities across multiple projects. That liaison is very important, because in the current climate, things do not happen very quickly. I'm sure all of you on the call will know this through times you've had to call, you've had to send emails. And I think the longer term establishment of flood action groups really helps embed that longer term partnership working, so those communities' voices are continuously heard. And I think working together as a parish council, or parish councils with flood action groups, is very key as well. I think working together builds that trust, understanding and relationship within that community. A parish council may have a flooding committee. That will be an agenda similar to that of a flood action group. The main difference, I think, is the engagement styles and the dedicated time needed, but flood action groups work supporting each other and in parallel with parish councils. They will make sure that there is a partnership there, but it also helps parish councils as well, because that local knowledge from flood action groups and areas of interest and invested parties helps collaboration on projects and schemes. And it's very important that flood action groups are aware and given that opportunity to steer the direction of any flood risk management initiatives that they want to get involved with in their area, in their village, in their catchment, using their knowledge and expertise. And I think that's the greatest progress is found when parish councils and flood action groups embrace and work together, because what then happens is you have a two-pronged approach when trying to deal with flood risk management and finding out what the longer term solutions are, both in relation to climate change adaptation and also within that flood risk management. And I think it also helps, and I'm sorry for this slide, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but I think it also helps yourselves as local authorities at that level help understand what flood action groups are looking at and what that might be needed in terms of partnership funding. Because from the high level, as you can see on the left there, obviously grants from DEFRA, the Environment Agency, Flood and Coastal Resilient Partnership funding is something that is done at that level, but is influenced by the information given. But also sometimes communities get feedback saying that maybe there's parish and town councils can look into ways of raising flood alleviation funds locally. And I think that's very difficult, especially in the current climate. And actually, if we can work together with those flood risk management authorities to find ways of raising those funds, albeit on certain levels, it may help. So I think partnership funding is real key here, and that collaboration, that community voice, we find the bigger the community voice, the easier it is for your organisations to be able to maybe look into some funding because you have the backing of a flooded community behind you. That was pretty much the presentation. If you'd like to get any more information on the National Flood Forum, I'll leave my details as well. There's just some links there as well to conversations that flooded communities have on our social media streams, and also just a chance for you to delve a little bit deeper. I'll also leave the National Flood Forum website link up and the blue pages if that's something people will need. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Sanjay, thank you very much indeed. And if I must say so, what you have given us is the classic example of self-help, because I think we all know it, particularly in flooding, and I've got quite a bit of experience years ago, it really is down to the communities, and very often people can suffer flooding, they get on with it, and a lot of other people don't know about it. But I think you've hit the nail on the head completely. Could I ask you a question from the chair? Part of our problem, I know, is, yes, climate change, but also the fact that so many properties have been built on the floodplain in England. Have we actually stopped that risk now, or are we still struggling with it?
No, unfortunately, the problem is still there. And what we set the National Flood Forum is, we have over 400 flood action groups across the country, and what we're trying to do is collate the main issues. One of the issues in relation to development is that there is still a lot of development going on floodplains. Now, one thing just to bear in mind is, and we always say this too, is one of the things that has come out since the Flood and Water Management Act of 2010 is that there can't be any risk passed on when building these developments. Now, there's a lot of connotations tied into that, but in some cases, not all, there is betterment. But the biggest problem that remains is that a lot of flood action groups across the country are telling us is that that's all well and done in legislation, but the problem is on the ground is there's not enough enforcement when these developments are being built. And the problem with that is that sometimes we all know to get things sped through, people cut corners. And some of the times, especially when these plans go through, there are a lot of conditions that need to be met. But sometimes if those conditions aren't checked and enforced, it's very difficult. So we are really pushing to try to ensure that if something is there within a condition, it needs to be met. We recently, and I will send this link over as well, is that we recently produced a document with the Town and Council Planning Committee to discuss some of these issues and kind of information and what to do next, and I can pass that on as well.
Thank you very much. Are there any, John, has John a question, I think?
Yes, I have. Sanjay, it's not something you actually mentioned, but I just wonder if you knew of any examples where the local flood action groups have got involved with parish councils when they're putting together their neighbourhood plans.
Well, I'm not, in terms of neighbourhood plans, I'm not sure at that level, because what flood action groups tend to do is they work solely on their flood risk side. What flood action groups have done, though, is when it comes to parish council meetings, they will either discuss that with the parish council, so there's information there when you're planning your neighbourhood plan, or in some cases, it's more at the resilience planning level. So flood action groups will help create the in terms of the emergency plan parish councils have, they might work on the flood side of that emergency plan. In terms of the neighbourhood plan, I'm not too sure. I've not got any examples of groups I work with.
Okay. I think there's a real potential for that, because the neighbourhood planning process is looking at future developments and where they are, the types of development, the extent of concrete and tarmac that's been spread everywhere, which is going to impact on runoff.
Yeah, there is one example recently, John, where a community I work with in Shropshire, they've been able to, the flood action group have now kindly been invited to whenever there's a planning committee meeting and it's discussing new development, especially on flood risk areas or floodplains, as you mentioned earlier. They have a chance to put the input in about that local knowledge of the flooding, because while again, it's very, I think there's a misnomer sometimes that flood action groups or flooded people are always against development. No, that's not the case. It's the point of making sure that it's correct development and it's not going to have an impact upon their flooding. So I think in that case, if you as parish councils, if you do have a local flood action group there, I think it would be great to integrate them into those discussions, because then you'll get the kind of rounded view of what they think as well in relation to the flood risk.
Yeah, I think maybe you've got a role there in making the flood groups aware of neighbourhood planning. It's not high profile generally outside of parish councils, and they could actually make some proactive approaches to their parishes to establish where they're at, or if they're doing neighbourhood planning, and offer to help.
Yeah,
thank you. Louisa, I think you have a question.
Yes, hello Sanjay. I was wondering where the flood forum stands on the issue of rewilding versus dredging. So I certainly remember during the floods of late 2013, 2014, lots of people became amateur hydrologists and said it's the Environment Agency's fault, they should be dredging the rivers. Yet other commentators like George Monbiot said, no, all dredging does is move the water down faster from village A to village B. We should be looking more rewilding rivers and returning to their natural state.
Yeah, no, I think Louisa, the message coming out, and I think it will stay the same, is that the Environment Agency or any local authority who deal with the flooding, dredging is something that's used as a last, not even a last resort, it's only used in a small section, because there's two things they say. A link to what you mentioned is that you may dredge that particular point out then, but then what will happen is it'll be filled up in quickly and then you have to do it again. And it's not a cost benefit, or it's not a cost effective way of managing the flood risk, because there's large stretches of river that you can't do it. And also there is a point in, you take away that level, you dredge that section, and then you increase the flow. Now what they tend to do now is they tend to focus on, you mentioned rewilding, but they also tend to try and focus on making sure that things such as looking further up the catchment, holding that water back. So looking at slowing it coming into areas, trying to ensure that if they take a catchment based approach, it's easier then, so you don't have to think about the questions such as dredging. It's a real shift change at the moment, because what they're trying to say is that it's not just looking at one section of a particular watercourse, it's trying to see how that affects the whole catchment and how you can work on it as a total solution. So dredging will always, I think, at the moment be something that, there are examples. I know that flood action groups work with Environment Agency to get small permits for certain small areas, but it's very, very rare in that sense. It's more looking at the kind of other examples on how to do that.
Thank you. John of Shipston has a question, I believe.
Yeah, it's more a matter of providing some information. People were talking about town councils and flood action groups working together. I can tell you that we've now made Shipston Area Flood Action Group, which is a very active group that's been active since 2007, when Shipston was badly flooded. And we've made them a working group, and the major reason for making them a working group was so they wouldn't have to pay VAT, because what we discovered was that as an autonomous group, they had to pay VAT on the works that they were doing, which seemed ridiculous. So we've structured them as a working group of the town council, and the town council and SAFAG, the Shipston Area Flood Action Group, did work together on the neighbourhood plan, and the neighbourhood plan has quite a strong flood action part in it. The other thing is, talking about the Environment Agency, SAFAG is working hand in glove with the Environment Agency. They are providing funding, they're providing all sorts of help and advice to SAFAG in order to slow the flow. What I can say is that we've been reasonably successful, although there have been multiple +3 metre events at Shipston Bridge, which would in the past have been down Church Street and in people's houses. We're managing to keep it just below the arches of the bridge, which is the key point, of course. And what we're at a situation now is, even though we've got over 600 natural flood management measures in upstream, slowing the flow down into Shipston, and clearly that then slows the flow on into Newbold and Alderminster and eventually Stratford, and all the downstream areas benefit from it. We're really at the point now where we're going to need some hard engineering measures up here in order to reduce that 20 tonnes per second that goes through Shipston Bridge heading down for you lot.
Well, I think John hit a really good point in relation to Shipston Flood Action Group. I mentioned earlier in my talk that the aim when we help support and create flood action groups is to leave them working independently and have a long-standing legacy. And National Flood Forum helped set up the Shipston Flood Action Group initially. And I think that's a really good example of things take time. Unfortunately, it's very difficult, I think, when we want a solution quickly. But what you can, as John mentioned, there was Shipston Flood Action Group, is that they've been long-standing for many years now, and they are looking at solutions. And then eventually it comes to the point where, again, as John mentioned, once you've done all you can as a community, you need to work in collaboration for what the agencies need to do, i.e. hard engineering solutions. But that's a benefit of a flood action group, is that community will always be invested within what's happening with their flood risk, because I know members of that group and they are flooded people.
Yep. Thank you.
Right.
And well done, Shipston. That's a tremendous account. Melinda, a question, please. No, sorry, can't get through to Melinda. Elizabeth, did you have a question? No. Sorry, you're
No,
on
I
mute.
must be, if it's me, if I had a thing, it was legacy.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I mean, we have a flood group, but we are not as strong as Shipston, being a
Yes.
village, and not that many. And we find it's sometimes difficult to get anybody to actually, I mean, from the agencies, they never seem to think that it's viable to help us to do things. So we are very much having to do it on our own.
No,
Yeah, okay.
it's very nice to see you again, Elizabeth. I know that we work together in Bidford, and I think that's another side just for yourselves, is that sometimes support shouldn't be limited. And unfortunately, what we find at National Flood Forum is, as a charity with no core funding, sometimes our breadth and time is limited. But we would love to come back and support. And another thing is that, please give us a ring, Elizabeth, if there's anything we can help with. But it's true, is that I think what we need is, communities can't be expected to do everything by themselves.
Yes.
They do need the support and help. And if National Flood Forum can, we get there when we can. But I think one of the things that we're finding is, with these increased events, with this more regular kind of climate change, the pattern of rainfall is now increasing. I think we do need much more support for communities like Bidford and other areas to help them kind of get more longer term established as well. And I know, Elizabeth, you've done a great job, but I understand that sometimes it can't be a one-man band, so to speak.
Well, I'll tell you what, Sanjay, I'll be in contact. And now that we have such things as virtual meetings, it might be an idea to set one up and have a chat. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I see Melinda is indicating. Come in, Melinda, if you can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was muted. I apologize for that. First, I'd like to say I'm hearing some really brilliant things these past couple days, and it's really got me going. Now, feeling good about everything. Now, the questions I had in reference to the flood situations are looking at the remedies that that you've been discussing, things like the damming to slow the flow and things like that. You also mentioned about a little bit, but not much, about incorporating, using it environmentally, like incorporating wildlife. Is there any ways to have more animals in the rivers, or to have more, like the otters and the beavers, or do they help? Or are there ways of certain tree plantings? Now, which group would be the best one to approach to get better information on that, on blending it together, so that when we do this to remediate the flooding, that we're also helping our environment and working with nature?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, just to mention, is that I did touch upon natural flood management. At the moment, currently, it is it's the buzzword, it's the thing going around, but it's something to mention that natural flood management isn't the solution to everything. It's not going to be the be all and end all. It needs to be part of a holistic solution, because some natural flood management interventions are kind of for what they call 1 in 5 up to 1 in 10 year events. And that's the 1 in 10 year, I'm pushing it there a little bit. So what you need is definitely a more holistic approach. So it needs to be a mix of that natural flood management, some potential hard engineering, but also, you mentioned, Melinda, the kind of wider issues with the wildlife. Well, what's recently happening is the catchment-based approach, which is an organisation which has been set up through government, is looking at the wider area looking at catchments within the country, and within that catchment, they're looking at all the issues to do with flood risk and biodiversity. And what you can do with the catchment-based approach is you can then start to think more in terms of well, how do we look at all these issues within the catchment and make sure that they tie in together? The Seven Rivers Trust have done something recently in Shropshire as well, again, where they've created a huge fish pass, which allows the effective kind of work on the flood risk, but without affecting that wildlife, and ensuring that the fish are able to pass through anything that might be constructed. Again, it needs to be, and I can only stress this more and more, is partnership approach. And all the times I mention this to you is that local communities are at the heart of this. Is that voice from a community is the way to push it up towards those, because it can't be stressed enough. People power is the only way to get things moving sometimes. And then another great example of that is recently, as you all may have seen in the news, I know again, before I started my discussion, you discussed development. I don't know if you saw in the news a few months back going a by-election where people voted with their voice and their feet, saying that we don't want these changes to the planning and development policy to come through. So you've got to think on the bigger strategy, but you've also got to try and bring things in closer as well to home.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question from John again from Shipston. John?
Yeah, I was just coming in on Melinda's comment. I think you're absolutely right, because we're conscious of the fact that a lot of the natural, well, nearly all the natural flood measurements, management measures that we've put in will have created wildlife benefit because they generate wetlands or ponds or slow the flow and produce environmental benefits. But because we've been focusing on flood action, we haven't really gathered the information about the environmental benefit that we've generated. And I think we could do with some advice on the side, and I'm not sure where that comes from, exactly as Melinda says, to look at the double benefit in that you're reducing the flood risk and you're generating environmental benefit. One of the things I was going to mention, because Sanjay mentioned the Severn Rivers Trust, is one of the things that they're doing out our way is promoting whole farm assessments, where they're going out, walking around with the farmer and the landowner to understand all the things that are going on in their land to make environmental improvements in their areas. And a number of those involve natural flood management measures. I think that's quite a good initiative that's going on there.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Melinda, you've also got the Warwickshire Avon catchment-based approach group, which you can also get information from, because they look at this as with all aspects in relation to biodiversity, wildlife, but also flooding as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, please, from colleagues? No, I feel a bit like an auctioneer in inviting bids or contributions. But on the assumption that there are no further questions, if we can perhaps draw this session to a close. Sanjay, can I thank you very much indeed for, frankly, a fascinating presentation, because I believe no tragedy is good, if you know what I mean, but I think the tragedy of flooding is one of the worst that people can suffer, because you indicated the time that it takes for many people to recover, 16 to 18 months. And we all know of other cases where it's taken several years, and they all dread that terrible event returning to them. It must be one of the worst nightmares. That's not to downgrade other tragedies, but it is. But congratulations to the work that you and your organisation are doing. I think it's absolutely brilliant, because you are basing it upon self-help. And as you have said in your talk on several occasions, self-help, people on the ground, local communities, they are the best response, because they know of the situation. And you've heard of something of our situation here in South Warwickshire, with Shipston particularly, for example, constantly suffering from flooding. But as you've heard, they do their own thing. Yes, they get help from Severn Trent and other bodies of that nature, but it's basically down to them. But thank you again for your time and for your expertise. We've enjoyed it thoroughly, and I think we've learned an awful lot from it. And I'll ask colleagues to show their appreciation in the usual way. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much. I need to head off now, but thank you, everyone. I hope the rest of the day goes well.
Thank you.